Okay, here we go. We're back. We're live for the 4 o'clock rock here on Tuesday. We are so happy to be with Brett Oppegaard, who is in the School of Journalism at UH Manoa. Welcome to the show yet again, Brett.
Thank you for having me back, Jay. I appreciate it.
Great to see you. And I wanted to tell you, in preparation for the show, I got a newsletter from the Civil Beat, and I'm looking at this article about journalism. The enemy of good journalism is shallowness, was the title. Attacks on objectivity overlook the bigger pitfall preventing good journalism. And I'm reading the article. I didn't notice the byline. You know, I thought, gee, this is great stuff. These are the issues we really have to wrestle with. And I decided I had to send it to you in anticipation of this show. But then at the last minute, as I was about to push the forward on it, you know, I noticed you were the writer. It was your byline. That's why I didn't send it to you.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you enjoyed it. I try to raise these serious issues in journalism and also in our society here and how journalism relates to it.
It's very important stuff.
Really.
And you're writing regular now for Civil Beat.
Right. I'm writing once a week column, comes out on Mondays, called Reader Rep. And my perspective is that I stand up for the reader. I'm not in any way trying to push Civil Beat's agenda or any other agenda. Simply, what do readers want to talk about related to journalism, and how can I promote that discussion?
That's great. We need that. And let me tell you, it reminds me of something the New York Times has called the public editor.
Right.
And the public editor, you know, as in your case, is the representative of the reader. Mm-hmm. He represents the reader effectively against the newspaper. So it's great to have that, because it means the newspaper can't do bloody anything it wants. It has some accountability, at least through this public editor and through you. Great.
Yeah, so one of my first columns was about Civil Beat, criticizing their use of anonymous sources. And this column here actually is about The Intercept. Glenn Greenwald is in a kind of a partner organization, and he wrote about journalistic objectivity as being a scourge on the earth that needed to be replaced by partisan media, and I don't agree with him on that.
You know that Pierre Omidyar, the guy who founded Civil Beat, is funding Glenn Greenwald. Yeah.
Right, and The Intercept.
Yeah. So that's the organization by which it's taking place.
Right.
Okay.
So that's the connection. Again, Civil Beat is, and I really respect them for doing this. They have said to me, "You write about whatever you want to write about. If it's us, if it's any of these other partner organizations."
And you took them up on that.
Yeah, I took it up on it, because I feel like that's important to show people that we're not just paying lip service to that. We're actually doing it.
It's really important, really important.
Yeah.
So we've called this inquiry we've made it in a number of luncheon programs. I told you 2 or 3 times already in our Hawaii Venture Capital Association luncheons back a few years ago, called Newsmorphosis. We had a number of programs with that in the title, Newsmorphosis. And it was all about the change in the newspapers starting in 2010 with the failure of the closure of the Honolulu Advertiser, which is tragic to have 2 papers and then turn around, you have 1 paper. And boy, you know, it reveals itself almost immediately. Right. About how the editorial policies change and the whole style and attitude of the paper changed. It was like when Aloha Airlines went out of business. You know, did you think that Hawaiian Airlines was going to be Mr. Nice Guy or a monopoly? Well, right. It was a monopoly. It still is a monopoly. Mm-hmm. And you want to go fly Neighbor Islands, it's $300. So, you know, clear what happens. These are basic principles of capitalism right. and journalism, too, I have to say. So here we are in a newspaper town of 1, plus Civil Beat, plus, Hawaii Free Press. I understand that Hawaii Report is trying to come back slowly. But you know, there's not a lot of news sources, and the old news sources are not, you know, what they were. And so, where do you think we are these days, you know, as a news source, a journalistic town? Are we in good shape? Are we in shape that's improving? Maybe your column is going to improve things.
Well, I hope that helps. But I would say Honolulu is not in much different of a situation than most cities, where they have shrunk down to 1 newspaper. The Telecommunications Act of 1996 has allowed radio stations and television stations to consolidate. So here you have Hawaii News Now has brought together a couple of television stations, and it really is good for a corporate bottom line, but terrible for a society and for the people that live in it, because you have nobody really watching the hen house. And that's where I think happens when, I mean, it's not only a reflection on the media, which nobody's really watching what they're doing, but also the media gets generally
Complacent.
lazy. Yeah, complacent's the right word. I wasn't going to say lazy, but I think it's more complacency. There's nobody that's going to compete with me this morning, so I can wait till tomorrow.
Yeah.
And in the old 2 newspaper towns, every morning people picked up the 2 newspapers and saw who had better staff and better stories, and that's who won the
competition.
day. Real competition. That's good for the readers.
Yeah, it was only last week when the Brussels attack at the airport, and my wife and I turned it on. It was maybe the week before, but we turned on the television, and at 10 o'clock in the evening, we see 10 o'clock in the morning in Brussels, and it's pandemonium, and there's all this fantastic, reaction to the attack. Then in the morning, I pick up the Star Advertiser, and on page 14, there's an article, maybe 6 column inches, and it talks about how something happened in a Brussels airport and 1 person was killed. It was really off base.
Right.
And the newspaper, even 12 hours later, didn't have what the television had in such detail 12 hours earlier. So, I mean, it pointed to me that, we live in a fast-moving world, and if you wait on the print press, you're waiting too long, whatever the print press is.
Yeah, the media used to be, or at least newspaper media used to be built around that morning delivery. And it has basically been flipped on its head in the sense that now the whole system is built around the constant updating of the web news, with the morning delivery just kind of freezing the moment.
Right.
And your story reminds me of a situation I was involved in many years ago, where I had created this investigative story about somebody who was taking grave markers and vandalizing them and throwing them off a cliff, and there was this whole piece about it. And one of my coworkers had created a story about food pills and how they were a trend, and we were both fighting for this front page slot, and there was a lot of tension there. And then that morning, we were an afternoon newspaper at that time, that morning the Oklahoma City bombing happened, and both those pieces took up the whole front page, and we just had a little tiny thing about Oklahoma City being bombed, because it was just like that snap decision, poor decision, poor decision.
If you were king of the universe and protective of the democratic society, what would you like for your model of journalism and the press and disseminating news and events, news information to the public? What would it look like in the utopian world?
Well, it definitely wouldn't have profit involved, because the profit is where I think the corruption begins, and also the special interests. When there's automobile advertisers in your newspaper that give you most of the money for your yearly budget, it's hard to write the investigative story about the auto dealers, robbing people or tricking people or whatever. Yeah. And I'm not saying they're doing that, but I'm just saying that's a story that people won't even touch because of that. Yeah. And
that's true. If you are afraid of recrimination, or they pull their advertising and whatnot, you don't go anywhere near them.
Don't even go anywhere near.
100 yards away, you stop.
No.
That's what happens.
I had a colleague a few years ago. He wrote automobile reviews, so we didn't do any kind of investigative reporting. This was a family newspaper, had a big auto dealer advertising base, and he must have written 500 positive auto reviews. He wrote 1 negative one. They pulled it out and wouldn't let him print it, and
so unfair.
Suspended him from writing reviews. And so that's the kind of thing that I've seen firsthand behind the scenes that I think is really troubling.
Yeah, and I wanted to make this comparison I made to you before the show began. If I take a dictator in South America somewhere, and he sends his black outfitted guys to wreck a newspaper in the middle of the night, they're going to be more careful in the morning about running this dictator down. So that's a kind of corruption. I mean, it's a corruption of the journalistic process. But I don't think we have that here in this country. What we have here is a consolidation, a large capital concentration owned by too few people who control the news and the way it's presented and the priorities of it. It's not just reporting or misreporting, it's the priorities of story, you know, what's important. And so when you have a consolidation like that and you have a capitalism, you build it all in, that's a corruption of another kind. We aren't getting what we should be getting in the utopian society. We're getting this corrupt kind of approach to things. This is hard. And this has been happening more and more, don't you think?
I think we get it on both ends because journalists every day do get threatened. I mean, I've been threatened to be punched, shot in the parking lot, beat up many times. And these are, you know, people will call you up with gravelly voices and say these things, and then they're scary things.
Yeah.
And so that does happen, still happens today. But then on the other end,
Happened here?
Not here, but at my previous job.
I have a story to tell you, which I think I'll tell you off the air where it did happen here, but go ahead.
Okay. So there's that pressure. There's the editor pressure of, you know, you need a certain amount of stories every day. You have to kind of fill the holes or show you're productive. So that's another kind of pressure that weakens journalism. And then at the very top end, like you said, you have this lack of competition pressure where the organization is really worried about their profit margin more than the great journalism. Not every media organization is like this, but a lot of them are like that.
So where do you put Spotlight in all this? I mean, I found that to be an extraordinary movie, not only because the movie was courageous, it really was, but it portrayed courageous people in the Boston Globe. Where does that fit? Is that common or uncommon?
I think journalists generally are pretty brave people, and they're generally nonconformists. They're generally people who will ask a tough question. There's a lot of really important things that journalists do that nobody else wants to do, and in that sense, they are sort of like superheroes. And if you look back in the history of journalism, they've often been portrayed as the heroes of stories, from Superman and Spider-Man.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
And then you have some of these romantic literature figures like Mark Twain and Ernest Hemingway. And so you have this great depth of romanticism about what journalism is and why these people do it. And I think Spotlight taps into that. It's not about the Boston Globe making money because they're losing money and they're in a really bad situation, but they've done something incredibly important here.
Yeah. I guess that's why journalists are so well paid.
Right, and work such great hours, and and everybody respects them and treats them nicely.
Why? You know, what do you say to your kids your students at the university, you know, on job prospects and, you know, like the future of the industry, the future of their careers? What do you say to them?
I say there's more journalism happening now than ever before. And eventually that is going to lead into, I think, ways for people to make a livelihood at it. I think, I mean, there's tremendously more journalism. We're talking, I don't know, an exponential increase in it. Now, a lot of that is blogging and social media and other types of programs that maybe aren't necessarily oriented toward profit making and paying people's bills. But I think people, particularly with a Spotlight movie, I mean, this is a chance for people to really say, why is journalism important?
That's why.
This is why.
That's why.
We didn't have journalists here. You know what would happen because you saw what happened before the journalists came in.
For decades.
The church just moved people around and nobody questioned it, and nobody was going to step in. Only thing that changed it was a journalist.
Well, the question I put to you just before the break here is that take that as an example, and it was a revelation. It was a revelation for the journalists, the newspaper, and the public who read it, and the people who watched the movie, which is a piece of journalism all in itself. It was a movie, but it was still journalism. And the question is, in the end, did that change? This is to reflect on. Did that change things? How much so? What was the process by which that actually changed, you know, an aberrant sector, if you will, of conduct in the society? We'll be back to discuss that.
Okay.
That's Brett Oppegaard. He's a teacher in the journalism, a professor in the journalism school at UH. And he is also a writer, a columnist for Civil Beat. And we're talking about newsmorphosis, exactly how is it changing around us? How is it changing our society? We'll be right back.
Aloha, my name is Carl Campagna. I'm the host of ThinkTech Hawaii's Education Movers, Shakers, and Reformers. You can see our show every Wednesday at noon at 12 p.m. on thinktechhawaii.com, as well as visiting YouTube and finding the link for the show there. The show is also aired on OC16. We look forward to seeing you on the show. We have many wonderful guests, including Joan Husted, Corey Rosenlee, where we talk about the very important issues of education for our keiki. We look forward to seeing you there. Mahalo.
Aloha, namaskar, and hello. My name is Anu Hittel, and I host the show called Climate Change Beyond Outrage. We go beyond outrage to find solutions to climate problems facing people, nations, and the world. I hope you will join me here every Tuesday at 1 o'clock. We broadcast live from thinktechhawaii.com. Aloha and bye-bye.
We're back, we're live. We're here with Brett Oppegaard of UH School of Journalism and also Civil Beat, talking about journalism in Hawaii and journalism in the world. So we had a guest a couple of weeks ago, Scott Foster is his name, and he runs the, I guess you call it a society that promotes death with dignity. And it's a bill that he's been trying to get through the legislature. He and his society have been trying to get through the legislature for decades, and they haven't been able to do it, and the Catholic Church has stood steadfastly against it for their own religious principles. And I think, this is another problem, with public policy. It's a problem in the legislature, and maybe to some extent it's a problem in journalism too, because the public doesn't know exactly who the interests are behind these arguments, these debates. And he's lost all these years, and he'll continue to put it in, but query, whether Spotlight really changed any of that.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of factors involved there, but I would say that the journalist is obligated to try to get the information out in a transparent way and get the discussion started and try to take it as far as the organization can or the reporter can. Now, what happens, and this is something that I've written about in my columns a lot, these anonymous behind the scenes manipulators or puppet masters will tell people, well, off the record, this and that, and then that somehow shapes the discourse to benefit them, but then they aren't held accountable for what they're saying. And that's a real scourge on journalism in my mind, in the sense that at the very minimum, journalists should say who their sources are, by name, by position, and then the audience can judge whether that's a credible source, and then how much weight to give that information. Taking the source name out, saying, our sources say, and this is something that I've been writing about a lot because I see it a lot here in Hawaii, that anonymous source just basically cripples the reader in the sense that you have no idea how valuable or valid that source is.
You can't make a judgment.
Can't make a judgment on it.
This goes back in a way to Glenn Greenwald. He says there is no objective journalism. We can do journalism on an opinion basis, and we mix the two, and we intermingle all of that, and that's what's happening, and that's, I guess, his view of it. It's obviously not your view of it.
No.
But isn't it getting that way? I mean, for example, if you say that your social media is journalism, and sometimes it's hard to say that, but a lot of that is just bald opinion. They don't even talk about sources, they just say it.
Right.
And it's all opinion, and people regrettably buy that. They buy that based on I'm not sure what. So we get a misinformation, disinformation going at various levels through the community. If I don't want to buy a print press newspaper, and I don't believe television, and I don't read things like Civil Beat, then I'm relegated to social media if I'm in my 20s. And social media is hardly a way for a democratic society to exist, don't you think?
Well, I wouldn't blame social media, but I would blame the choice of the channels. So if you connect to the channels that have a journalistic ideology, you'd be fine. The social media is just another way to distribute the news. But what I think struck me most about Greenwald's column, and the thing that kind of inspired me to write a response to it, was the idea that he argues that partisanship is the way journalism should be, because that's the best way to kind of put your cards on the table and have a discussion. Now, we did this when the yellow journalism days, muckraking days, we actually went away from that, and that has helped to define American journalism, this objective stance on news. Not to say we don't have bias, because people do have bias, and there's nothing you can do about that. But but the impulse is to try to seek a fair, neutral ground where accurate information is shared. And I'd say that, to me, is more along the lines of the Socratic method than what Greenwald is arguing, which I would relate to sophistry. Basically, the idea that people try to persuade others. And the biggest problem with this, in my mind, is, and I did a lot of reflecting when I was writing this column about this, why this troubled me so much. And I think it's because people no longer talk to each other through this, neutral space, this common ground. What they do is they throw back and forth, my source says this, your source says that, I'm right, I don't believe yours. And so the partisanship, in my mind, allows people to dismiss other people's viewpoints just broadly. Like, oh, you heard that on Fox News, I don't believe it. I don't care what it was.
Right.
Even though it may be true. It may be a very important story.
Right.
But if you say it's from Fox News, or if you're on the other side, you say it's from MSNBC, just dismiss it completely.
Yeah.
Or I heard this on Rush Limbaugh, dismissed. Or I heard this on Tom Hartman, dismissed. And that's the trouble I have with partisan media, because it doesn't bring people together. It just has people shout at each other.
Well, that's certainly happening in the election. You mentioned that, and I find this election different, I'm sure you do too, than anything that I've ever seen in the past that I've noticed. Everybody is lobbing missiles at everybody else. It's a ball game. It's a very aggressive ball game. It's like watching a football game. And at the same time, the players are playing the press.
Yeah.
A guy like Donald Trump is a very sophisticated player. He sees it for what it is. He sees the capital concentrations. He sees the needs of journalists to have raw meat stories. He sees the way to affect their thinking. He's got so many tricks up his sleeve. I'm sure he has some brilliant guys, who counsel with him. But isn't that what's happening? It's not only an adversary process where people are arguing and they find something to argue about in every issue, and they summarily disregard the other guy's argument. It's not like a legitimate debate. But also they play the press. They're trying to psych the journalists, and the journalists are willing in large part to be psyched. I think he's been very successful, because his public doesn't come direct. His public comes through the journalists who write about him and publicize him. And they're the ones who deliver the message to all the people on the street who get into fights about him.
Well, there's a couple of things going on there, I think. Number one, with the weakening of the journalism industry, a lot of the top reporters have been hired away by public relations firms. And so you simultaneously take away the top people and put them into positions of manipulators, and they know the way the game works. They know how to get their stories in there. They know how to argue the points that they want to have inserted, and that dynamic has really twisted around the way journalism should be. Yeah. So that's part of it. And then the other part, and this is where I think Greenwald is right, the objectivity impulse, which journalists have really been going away from because of this whole loophole in it, is the idea that all ideas are weighted equally, and they aren't. So like, for example, climate science. If you have 99% of climate scientists saying that humans are causing an increase in the Earth's temperature, we have 1% saying that's not the case, those aren't equal. But with the objective stance, oftentimes they're given equal play and people get confused. Yeah. And so I think that loophole has been exploited a lot recently, which is why journalists are going away from that objective stance and going to to more of a fairness doctrine.
Well, what is the move you make if you find that the 99 out of 100 people are on one side of the boat and one is on the other side, but he's very shrill and making a big racket and using, very emotion-charged language, well-selected language. What do you do as a journalist to recognize him, but also show that he's a small percentage of the people?
Well, that's where they, I think, need to be really careful how they craft the piece. It's not just like a throwaway line, which what it usually seems to be. I'm writing a column now about the energy infrastructure here, and how the argument against alternative energy by the fossil fuel companies has been very strong. Like, there's no reason why Hawaii should try to be energy independent. This is going to cost the people so much more money, and there's just no reason to do this. It's going to be so much cheaper. And these arguments are never followed up with deeper questions in the media, like, what do you mean by that? I mean, give us some data. You can't just say that. And I think that's what you're talking about in terms of, I'd say, shrewd special interest representatives placing information into the media that confuses ordinary citizens.
Yeah, including former journalists who know how that works.
Including the former journalists who know how to do it. Yeah. And the way, and this is again as my role as a reader rep, I want to help people understand what's happening there and raise their guard against that kind of discourse.
Yeah.
And how do you combat it? You have to get information from lots of different places and be proactive, not just sit back and watch the 5 o'clock news and take everything as gospel. But it's a lot of work, and people. This is the thing that I think also hurts the readers is readers are not full-time news consumers. They have a job, they have family, they have soccer games, they have things they want to do. So they have all these other things they want to do in life, and they just want to get their news and have it be fair to them. And in a lot of cases, we're letting them down in that respect with the current state of journalism.
Yeah, and we'll take a short break, Brett. But after we come back, I would like to talk about the effect of these changes, these sea changes you've been talking about, on our society, on our democratic process, on how we do legislation and executive orders, how the courts conduct themselves, and how people in the street feel about their relationship with the government. Whoa, lots of changes there. And I will ask, what is the connection between the two? Exciting discussion with Brett Oppegaard, UH Department of Journalism, and also a columnist for Civil Beat, and one who follows what we follow, Newsmorphosis. We'll be right back.
Aloha, I'm Kaui Lucas, host of Hawaii is My Mainland, here on ThinkTech Hawaii every Friday at 3 p.m. We address issues of importance for those of us who live here on the most isolated landmass on the planet. Please come join me Fridays at 3 p.m. Mahalo.
Aloha, this is Reg Baker. I'm the host of Business in Hawaii. We air every Thursday at 2 o'clock on thinktechhawaii.com. We broadcast from the ThinkTech studios in downtown Honolulu, and we talk about positive and successful companies in Hawaii. People that have been successful despite the obstacles. They all have a good story to tell. Hopefully we'll see you on Thursday at 2 o'clock. Aloha.
Bingo, we're back. Now we get into the real crux of the matter. We get into our democracy, where we live.
Great.
So I always think of, Mr. Smith goes to Washington, and he's pure-hearted, and he goes to do the right thing, and everybody around him is, I know it wasn't quite like that, but at least I don't think the problems of journalism and the press were so pronounced then as they are now. You could get so confused. If you go, for example, to the 6 o'clock or the 10 o'clock news, you get sports, weather, crime, and car accidents, and precious little else. So at the end of the evening, are you prepared to be a citizen in our democracy? Do we have an electorate that knows what is going on? Can they make the right decisions when they are called to exercise their franchise and vote? And my answer would be, I'm really not sure anymore. I don't think they are prepared. Do you think they're prepared?
Generally speaking, no, although there are exceptions. I think generally speaking, the media literacy is very low, the civic literacy is very low, participation is historically low here in terms of voting. So that those are all pieces of evidence against that. And I think what's really happening here is people are getting distracted by all these other parts of their life, and they're losing track of their primary role as a citizen.
Yeah. And they have people out there who are trying to do public relations on them and change their opinions in large numbers of people, change their opinions about something, even if the one who is trying to change their opinion knows that's wrong. And
Yep.
even if a right-thinking citizen could, in a better time, discern that it is wrong, but nevertheless, he buys it like a cow. He buys it, and he takes it to the polls. And I mean, over time, this has got to create a downhill run for any democracy, but especially our democracy. We are the cradle of democracy, and this has got to be part of it. What you do and your students has got to be part of it. And you must have the sense that, this is a downhill run.
Well, the key for me is not to make a cynical viewpoint with the students or with the public, but create skepticism, healthy skepticism. So when people, and this is also part of media literacy, when people look at a newspaper story or watch a news broadcast, they ask the questions like, how do you know that? Why do you know that? Who are you talking to? What's the other perspective on this? And why isn't it being shown?
But if I go on Fox News, and I don't go very much, if I go on Fox News, I see them arguing till the cows come home. I see them arguing, yelling at each other, over-talking each other, and at the end of the day, I don't know what's going on. I'm interested in the raw meat of it because they're having this really excited argument. That's not the kind of contention you mean, I know. What is the right kind of contention you would like to see so that people can make their minds up, after hearing both sides or all sides of an issue?
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to Socrates and the Socratic method. I mean, Socrates was famous for just asking why. And why is that? Why do you know that? And how do you know that? And just and the switch there is not to try to persuade somebody, and that gets back to the sophistry reference, but the key is seeking the information to find out as much as you can. And the more important something is to you, that should be the time when you invest more of your resources in finding out.
Yeah.
So if it's something simple like, what time is the local carnival, obviously you don't have to spend a lot of time deconstructing the media. You just want to know what time the carnival starts.
Factual.
Right. But if you want to know why has the elevated rail cost so much more, and who's been watching that, and how have all these change orders come in, and I mean, this just seems like a fiasco from afar. And where are the journalists in this?
Yeah.
They're just documenting the fiasco. They're not saying, they're not as far as I can tell, they're not holding people accountable.
We're implementing a program here on ThinkTech. You can see our little sign. We have a hotline, and we can give the number,
Sure.
and we can have people call in, and we want to do that. Hawaii Public Radio does that on certain shows, and I did it when I was there at Public Radio. But I feel that that's part of this Socratic method that you're talking about. Ask me a question, and then judge my answer.
Yeah. And just keep asking.
Yeah.
'Cause everything you say, there's going to be more questions to.
Yeah.
So it can be an endless stream of questions, and then you only stop when you feel satisfied, like you 100% know where
One
that
way or
person's
the
coming
other,
from.
Right.
Yeah.
Could be bad place, good
Could
place.
be bad, and it's often mixed.
But you know what? Some people, they can, even if they ask questions, you still have to have critical thinking to evaluate the answers. You still have to know something about government and civics. You have to know about your role as a person entitled to citizen. And some people don't have that. And that's another show, another issue. But it seems to me that you cannot appreciate the news, whatever sources there are, whatever Socratic method is happening in front of you, unless you have the skill to do critical thinking. Isn't it true? Otherwise, you get confused, even if you have all the information.
I mean, this is part of the public relations strategy, is to confuse people when you can't win the argument. So, but I also would argue back that journalism really the most populist form of education there is. I mean, for 50 cents or $1, you can find out the whole day's news, and you can read it, and you can try to make sense of your world. And there's no cheaper way to learn about the world than picking up a newspaper. And so in that sense, I would say that newspaper journalism, television journalism has educated the masses in ways that our formal systems couldn't do.
Yeah.
Now,
Or wouldn't.
Or wouldn't do. And what is, unfortunately, I think is happening now is, like we talked about earlier, with the consolidation and the profit motives of the media kind of contorting their, I guess, basic drive of what they want to do, that has put this dynamic at risk.
Yeah, it is at risk. And, query, how do we fix it? How do we make people appreciate what they're hearing and make valid decisions, or at least thoughtful decisions about it? And I like to think that we could educate them. The thing about news being an education is that most people give up education when they get out of school. They're only too happy to put it behind them. Mm-hmm. But if you took another view of that and said, everything I learn is education.
Yeah.
This show is educating me.
Absolutely.
Everything we try to do here is public education.
Mm-hmm.
And so you say, well, if you treat that all as education, seriously, take it seriously, then you'll be a better citizen, because then you'll develop critical thinking skills and the ability to discern the wheat from the chaff, what you hear,
Mm-hmm.
and when somebody's trying to manipulate you, and when somebody is being straightforward with you.
That's part of the growing media literacy. So if your first exposure is, say, the nightly news, and you get some information there, that might inspire you to, say, pick up the computer and log into Civil Beat and read some of their stories, and then that might inspire you to look at the New York Times, and then that might inspire you to look at one of the London papers, and then you start getting a bigger viewpoint of how the world really works.
Yeah. One of the elements you say, look at, I just want to dwell on the word look at for a moment. And this has always been the case, I think, when you write something for a newspaper, or for that matter, an online newspaper, you can come up with what title you like, but there's a fair chance that the editor is going to change that. I wrote for the Honolulu Advertiser and the Star Advertiser for a total of 6 or 7 or 8 years. I don't think my headline, my title of any article ever got through once. They always rewrote it.
Oh, okay.
And I said, why is that? Why are they doing that to me? I can choose words for a title. I can accurately describe what I want to say. Well, I think I don't know this for sure, but I think the answer is, if you are the editor and you look at the whole paper, take it together comprehensively, you want to present a certain shtick, a certain landscape mm-hmm. to the public, and these articles have to relate to each other. Mm-hmm. And also, and this is a little scary, I'd like your thought on this, is most people, I don't know what percentage, but a high percentage of people stop at the headline.
Yeah, they
They
do.
just read the headline.
Read the first 3 paragraphs.
So the guy who has the right
mm-hmm.
to craft the headline is actually more influential than the author of the article.
Yeah, in a lot of ways. That's right. I think the headlines set a tone, and they also, one other thing I wrote about in this column, or recent columns, is the idea that mass media journalism is a normalizing mechanism. It's set up to turn us back in from anything that gets too far out of the mainstream. And that is probably similar to what you're saying with the headlines. Like, okay, this is a little bit weird, we want to make it normalized. So when you pick up a newspaper or watch the nightly news, you're basically getting a real down-the-middle perspective on the world, and if anything goes too far off, they twist it back around and make it seem weird or odd, and,
That's why you like to read these off-the-wall pubs, like, well, I won't mention names, but there's some in this community that they'll report it any way they want, and they're unbounded. Say it, they'll style it any way they want. But I want to, we only have a minute left, and I just wanted to ask you one other thing, and that is, if journalism has a salient effect on our democracy and thus our future, then it would seem that the journalist has a special trust, a special obligation, a special role in our society. 5th column, whatever, right? And I suspect that you're teaching journalism and you're writing for Civil Beat and wherever else for a reason. How do you perceive that reason?
Well, I think the journalist is the kind of last bastion of the course is intended to persuade you in one way or another. Journalism is intended to show you how people are trying to persuade you. So I think that that's what really pushes me to keep after this craft, is to try to peel away the things that are somehow designed to manipulate me in particular ways, and try to find what really is the core of what's happening, and then make my own decision. So I think there's that independence and freedom that comes with that I find really powerful. And I think readers who appreciate good journalism, that's what they look for. That's what they want, that independent voice that is not in some way trying to sell them something or get them to vote a particular way, but just to help them find their own view on the world.
Yeah, but maybe inherent in that, there's something more, it seems, and that is you're giving them a gift. You're giving them the truth, and you get the gratification of knowing that maybe sometimes they agree with you. Maybe they don't agree, but they're thoughtful. They include your input in their thought process. And all of that reaching people, to me, in the human condition, that's very gratifying, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It is. I mean, what I do is I feel good about it. Like, I wouldn't necessarily feel good if I was trying to trick somebody or try to manipulate them to do something I know they didn't want to do. But I feel good about sharing information that I think is unvarnished, and then people can do with it what they want. That gives me the joy in producing journalism.
Yeah, great. That's better than money anyway, right?
Yeah, I think so. And certainly is wonderful. Yeah, I mean, you think about intrinsic rewards, and that's what brought me into the field, and that's what keeps me in it.
Good for you.
Yeah.
You have to come down again and tell us about further changes and sea changes in Newsmorphosis.
I would love to do that.
Thank you, Brett.
Thank you for having me.
Brett Oppegaard, a journalist par excellence at the UH and at Civil Beat. Thank you.